is no problem too large for government to solve and no concern too small for it to care about.
A voice that most people, most sane, rational people, smart people, agree is one of the most conservative voices in the state of Wisconsin and beyond.
Will is an indispensable organization.
The essential mission is to keep the republic.
Welcome back to If You Can Keep It, a podcast created by the Wisconsin Institute for Law and Liberty. This is Will Communications Director Pat Garrett, and joining me as always is Will President and Founder Rick Esenberg for another episode. Socialism is now part of mainstream politics. Self-described Democrat socialists are winning elections. Younger Americans hold more favorable views of socialism than previous generations, and proposals for bigger government and economic control are becoming more common. And by the way, that's coming from both parties. But what exactly is it? Our guest today is someone who spent much of his career studying the issue at the center of today's political debates. Dr. Samuel Gregg is with the American Institute for Economic Research. He currently serves as the president of and Friedrich Hayek Chair in Economics and Economic History. He's a Bradley Foundation Prize winner and the author of 17 books on economics, history, and Western civilization. So if there's anyone who can help us separate the myths from the reality of socialism and capitalism, it's Dr. Gregg. Well, Sam, thanks so much for joining us today. And Rick, we're glad to have you back as always.
Thank you.
Let's just kick off this discussion. Socialism's on the rise in America, perhaps. Would you agree with that or maybe disagree? And Sam, we'll let you go first.
Well, thanks for having me on. Socialism is one of those words that can mean a lot of different things. And I think if you talk to many people in America today who describe themselves as socialists, you'll get a variety of answers about what they mean by that. Now, there'll be some that have in mind what they think Scandinavian countries are like. Of course, they're thinking of Scandinavian countries as they existed 50 years ago. Others will see socialism in terms of things like nationalization of certain industries, etc. Then there are others who I'd say are essentially cultural Marxists, and a lot of their emphasis is less about economics and much more about how they think different structures in society are biased against any number of different groups, etc. In fact, when you ask a lot of people about it, when they say they're a socialist, they often give very incoherent, very frankly incoherent answers about what they mean by this phrase. But what they are against, I think they're often better defined about what we're against. They clearly have reservations about capitalism. They clearly have deep reservations about the market economy, especially a dynamic commercially orientated economy, such as we find in the United States. And in the case of American socialists, they have a lot of problems with the American founding as well. So it's not just that they're incoherent about a lot of the things that they believe in, they're actually pretty consistent in what they say they're against.
I think that's a really good point. I think it's not just in, because capitalism exists in other countries, exists in other forms. But really what some of these candidates are pushing, what some of this ideology is pushing is actually an attack on America's founding and just the basic America principles and our republic. And I think, we talk a little bit about, the populist movement per se, and socialism finds a home. And honestly, so does a little bit of MAGA politics too. And I think Rick's talked a lot about that as well. It'd be interesting to hear why socialism maybe has taken root in the Democratic Party, more so in the last, maybe these candidates that call themselves DSAs in the last couple of years versus the last 10 years?
I think there's a number of reasons for that. I think it's fair to say that the Democratic Party as a whole has drifted in a leftward direction for a while now. This is not the Democratic Party of, say, Bill Clinton in the 1990s. I often like to say that in terms of free market economics, Bill Clinton wasn't actually bad as a president. It was not a bad record in terms of free markets. But if you look at the Democratic Party today, the emergence of people who are often quite young, that's one interesting thing about this, a lot of them are quite young. A lot of them are also university educated. And I think it's also the case that one of the reasons for their dissatisfaction with the status quo, and that's emerged more recently, is that things that they assumed would happen in the past don't seem to be happening as quickly as they used to. So once upon a time, it used to be the case that getting a college degree was sort of a guarantee of a good job for the rest of your life. That is no longer the case. And so there are a lot of these people who have gone to college and have taken out big loans to do degrees that employers aren't actually very interested in hiring for in the first place, but also have given them a view of the world as one that's fundamentally unjust. So I think here that the radical shift of colleges and universities in a leftward direction, which has been going on, as we know, for quite some time, but which has accelerated over the past, I would say, 10 years, I think that helps to explain some of this radicalization as well.
I was very interested in your comment at the end that they have problems with the American founding, because I think the American founding is essentially distrustful of the exercise of government power and the excesses of democracy. It was born out of our Constitution was born out of a revolution, but it's not itself revolutionary. In fact, it tends to force consensus by checking the exercise of power. And our founders would have not been surprised that there would be episodic attempts to use a democratic form of government to fundamentally change society, and they don't want that to happen. The question for me is, why is it happening now? Perhaps it's a product of inequality. I take the point about the belief that things today are not happening as fast as they did in the past. However, I graduated from college a long time ago, in the late 1970s. And I knew at the time when I entered college in 1974 that if I just went and got a liberal arts degree, that I wasn't going to get any particularly special job. I was really going to have to go to graduate school or pick something that had a greater market demand. It's one of the reasons that I minored in economics. I thought if this law school thing didn't work out, maybe I could go to grad school and I could do that. So I'm not sure that things are as different as they once were, but people really believe it, and this is why we see the numbers we do among young people with support for socialism or socialist adjacent ideas.
And you look at some of these, let's just say, campaigns across America right now in some of these primaries, and we'll get to primaries in a second, but there does seem to be a concentration of support in urban areas where you either have a big university. I think Madison, Wisconsin is a great example, but I could also see, like a Milwaukee, Wisconsin, where, you have a lot of college graduates move to as well. And so I think, there is a geographic concentration to some of this, because as you kind of move away from a college educated voter, let's just say someone who didn't get a 4-year degree, I think these viewpoints become less relevant, but our media tends to elevate kind of the voices of those with a college degree, in my opinion, too. So I maybe there is just, this is more limited and more of a bubble, but I'd be curious what you guys think about that.
Well, on the one hand, I think it's true that it's harder for, let's call them the Democratic Socialists of America, socialists in general. They've had difficulty getting their message out from beyond these particular bastions, if you like. So a place like New York, if you look at who voted for Mandami, which I think is part of what you're pointing to, a lot of them were tertiary educated, young men and women, often who had moved to New York in a relatively recently ago. Now, if that's the demographic, and if you look at that in outside those particular areas, then it's not obvious that they necessarily have the same traction, say, in Wisconsin or Michigan, or let alone the South or parts of the Southwest, etc. But I will say this, we will find out pretty soon how much traction some of these groups have outside those particular areas, because we'll see in some of these Midwest states, Michigan, Wisconsin, etc., where you do have people in the Democratic Party running for the nomination of their party, whether it's for governor, whether it's for senator, Congress, etc. Let's see if some of those people actually get the Democratic nomination and beat more centrist-aligned Democrats. That's going to be a big test to see how much traction some of these groups have. But I also think something else is worth mentioning here, and that is that as part of this emergence of socialism, I think it's important to keep in mind that we've seen across the political spectrum in America as a whole, we've seen a shift away from markets and towards more favorable views of government intervention. This is my standpoint. This is a problem on the right as well. We've seen significant numbers of conservative groups, conservative institutions who have largely abandoned or heavily qualified what I thought were once their strong commitments to limited government and free markets. And they're also more willing to give government a chance to deal with any number of problems. Because I think Rick is right. The American founding is heavily driven by the skepticism of concentrations of power and also skepticism of what we might call populism from whatever part of the spectrum it comes from. So if we've seen a general shift across America in this leftward direction, then we shouldn't be surprised that the center-left party has also headed left in ways that would have been harder to imagine 10, 20 years ago.
Yeah, I mean, we put out a report recently where we did some polling, we did some focus groups. We wanted to find out, why populist-leaning, self-identifying MAGA Republicans felt about issues and why they felt about them. And we did ask a battery of questions about economic issues, and we found substantial support, often majority support, for various types of price control and government intervention in the economy. We even found a substantial plurality of Republican-leaning voters who passed through a screen for populism or self-identified as MAGA, who supported government limitations on corporate profits. So, I mean, it's a different world than it was 10 years ago among Republicans. And, our goal was to try to find out what appeals we might make or others might make that will persuade these folks that they're wrong. And there are some, but there's no denying the fact that there's been a substantial move away from markets and economic liberty on the right.
And that's kind of my first question I was getting at too, is like, what is driving this? So I think, the center right had a really good election in the 2022 and 2024 election, partially because of COVID-19. I think you could almost, we saw the heavy hand of government kind of come in and force businesses to shut down, force kids out of school, made a great argument for school choice, for example. The online learning, like it showed parents what was going on, right? And I'm just using this as a backdrop. So what in the free market economy, maybe what parallel has now happened that has caused this surge leftward? Because there is a deep skepticism of corporations, corporate profits, and maybe it's AI driven, but it's being felt on the left, it's being felt on the right. And I don't know, like, is there a year or 2 year time frame where just the so-called corporate economy just got out of control? I don't know.
Well, let's say some thoughts, and I'm sure Rick has thoughts as well. I think a lot of the skepticism about markets and the role of government and advocacy of more intervention in the economy, I don't think those of us who believe in free markets have ever quite been able to push back against the narrative that developed around the 2008 financial crisis. Now, that's almost 20 years ago. But I think the financial crisis did a lot of reputational damage to American capitalism in general and corporate America in particular. Now, I'm sure Rick and I could probably sit here and explain to everyone for the next 3 hours why a lot of that crisis was driven by very bad government housing policy. It was partly driven by interest rates being kept too low for too long, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that those are the right explanations, but it doesn't matter. We lost the public argument. We lost the public rhetorical argument about all that. And I think that a lot of younger people have grown up in the shadow of all that, which is very different to the world I grew up in, when socialism and the planned economy and Keynesianism and all these things were on the back foot. Now it's the other way around. But I do think the 2008 financial crisis has had a lot to do with that. I also think that the emergence of China as an economic and political rival to the United States has also led a lot of people to rethink their commitment to free markets and limited government. Now, the rise of China as an economic and political power has not caused me to rethink my commitment to markets or to limited government. I think us trying to replicate China would be a very bad idea. And I think China is going to pay in the long term a big price for some of the policies that it's embracing now. But if you think about the emergence of China and how many people perceive it now as becoming a serious rival to the United States, and I actually think China is a serious problem. I don't want to downplay that China is a serious problem. But I think it explains why quite a few people on the right in particular have shifted away from markets and towards things like industrial policy, more willingness to use tariffs and protectionism, even things like something I didn't think I'd see, which is the government taking shares in private businesses. I think the China phenomena and the financial crisis, if you throw a lot of other things in there, I think that helps to explain some of these trends that we are seeing. It's remarkable, I find, that if you look at some of the economic policies of Bernie Sanders and President Trump, there are many areas which they're actually completely in accord. And I think that's telling about where politics are in America right now.
There was a book, Selena Zito wrote a book right after the Trump's first election, in which she interviewed voters who had gone from Obama to Trump. And she had, I think, 7 archetypes of voters, groups of voters who'd done that. And the remarkable thing about it is that about half of them could as easily have voted for Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren as Donald Trump. I mean, they were not what we've come to think of as conservatives. I think the financial crisis, you mentioned the financial crisis, is astute. I think that the financial crisis did great damage to people's trust in institutions and elites, right? This wasn't supposed to happen, and yet it happened. I've also been struck, by the problems presented by long-term trends in inequality. I mean, I think a lot of times the way that we've tended to respond to that on our side is to say, well, really, why do you care when your standard of living keeps going up? And I think that misses the way people assess their situation. They compare themselves to others. And there was a book, I probably know it better than I do, by this economist named Tyler Cohen, maybe 10 years ago, called "Average is Over." And there is a sense in which there's been greater returns to people who have extraordinary talents or who have engaged in exceptional innovation. I think on a household level, that's probably been exacerbated by assortative mating. I mean, it used to be that, the lawyer would marry a secretary and she'd stay home, and now it's a couple of lawyers that are married, and they enjoy a much higher standard of living for that. At least a material standard of living. And so now you have AI on the horizon. Some people think that's going to really exacerbate that. My own guess, but I'm going to guess, I don't know, I'm a lawyer, is that it will in the short run for sure, but perhaps not in the long run, because people's needs are inexhaustible, and they'll find something that they want other people to do for them and pay for it.
I think that what the point you're making there, Rick, is important, because I think it was Alexis de Tocqueville. He pointed out that, I think in Democracy in America, that when he's talking about inequality, we don't judge ourselves on the basis of, say, where our grandparents were or people living in the 18th century. By any standard, we're much better off than they are. We're always looking to whoever is here and now who is better off than us. And that changes. Sometimes it's driven by technology, sometimes it's driven by patterns of marriage, etc. One thing I would throw in is that one thing I do worry about, which I think has translated into support for some of these populist movements and on the left and the right, is with the breakdown of a lot of family life and marriage, etc. So some of these cultural trends, that's cashed out in somewhat class-orientated terms. So middle-class people in America, they marry, they get jobs, they tend to stay married, they have children, they tend to go to church or synagogue, etc. If you look at blue-collar America, you see lots of living out of wedlock, you see a lot of illegitimacy, you see high levels of drug use, you see breakdown of what we would call civil society. Blue-collar people generally are not affiliated with a religious group, etc. And that actually happens to be one of Donald Trump's most loyal political constituencies, interestingly enough. So I think some of those cultural trends are very important when we're trying to understand some of these social dynamics and how they cash out politically. And of course, the issue is that I don't think there's a state government intervention into the economy that's going to fix those sorts of issues. Those are cultural problems, and people trying economic solutions to cultural problems, which is, I think, is what you find on a lot of the right today. They generally don't work. It's like trying to use financial incentives to encourage people to have children. This has been a very popular idea on some parts of the right, but it doesn't work. It doesn't work. We know this doesn't work from every place that it's been tried. And so I find it interesting that you have some people on the right who are looking for economic solutions to cultural problems, which they rightly lament. But cultural problems demand cultural solutions, and economic interventions to try and fix some of these problems usually don't work, and they often come with a lot of unintended consequences.
Yeah, that's a fascinating point. I'm reminded of the candidate for governor in Wisconsin, Francesca Hong, who says that, when she talks about crime and poverty, says we have to be tough on causes. And for her, being tough on the causes of crime and poverty means throwing more money at them. And the problem with that is that the government really can't replace your family. And if these cultural presumptions and norms are eroded, they become very, very difficult to fix through politics. And so, I mean, you're right about the way this gashes out among different classes. I used to be a partner at a big law firm, and I was always struck by the fact that my colleagues were people who uh, worked as rapacious capitalists. They lived as conservative Christians, but yet they would have posters of Che Guevara on their wall, and they would, just refuse to affirm, traditional cultural values. This is not cool, and I think that over many, many, many years has had a very unfortunate effect on us. I mean, we become a culture that I think too much celebrates transgression and sort of norms about oppression narratives.
How do you fix some of these cultural issues? How do you even talk about them? Because Rick, you just said, the government cannot replace your family. But what about people without, there's people born into a lack of a strong family, and what do they do? And what is the answer then?
Well, there are scholars in America who've been working on some of these questions. A good example is Yuval Levin, who I believe you've had on your program before. He's got some very good ideas about some of these things. Um, but it but it requires affirming that things like um, not all family arrangements are going to produce the same results. We do know that when two people get married and they stay married and they live in, they have common values, they have a common structure, that they do provide certain uh, guidelines and guardrails to their children, that they educate them in particular ways, etc. They encourage certain moral habits. That tends to produce people who are better equipped for life in a free society and can help sustain a free society. But we have to, I think the starting point is we have to have a very difficult conversation, and that is to say that not all choices are equal. Not all choices are going to produce the same outcomes. Liberty comes with personal responsibility, that a free society requires people living out certain habits or what you might call virtues. And of course, the founders understood this very well. You see them, they talked about liberty, but they talked about virtue a lot as well. And we need institutions to affirm those sorts of things. Now, that's a very difficult conversation to have, because the moment you say that, well, there are virtues, then that implies that there are other types of ways that people make choices that are objectively wrong. We call them vices. That's a very difficult conversation to have in a society that is pretty relativistic in many ways when it comes to thinking about these types of things. But unless you have that conversation, and unless you're willing to say, look, this set of norms and principles are worthy of your choices and they're worthy of you living your life by, and these are not, then you're going to have a great difficulty. And the other part of the problem is a lot of the institutions that used to do this type of formation, let's call it character formation, don't do that as much as they used to. I think religious institutions have, for the most part, stopped doing a lot of that over the past 20 to 30 years. Not all of them, but quite a few have. And instead, they're preferred to talk about things that are just way outside their purview, right? So when I'm at Mass and I hear a priest starting to talk about the minimum wage and is not talking about things like, when you make these commitments, you should live up to them. When you have these beliefs, you should stick to them, etc. And when they're talking about things that they actually have not much to say about in terms as qua economic issues, for example, then they've missed the point. So the more a lot of these organizations have swapped out social justice stuff, what they call social justice, for formation of character, that's left a huge gap in its wake.
I would agree with that. I think like if we're pushing, I mean, too often we hear, especially like religious institutions, and I think it's also elsewhere, it's schools, people pushing policy solutions. And again, it mainly only comes in one way. It's always like a group of people who think government is always the answer. And I think that's really a fascinating point.
I think that's all correct. I was going to jokingly say that you should actually come to my parish. We never talk about minimum wage or politics. It's not everything.
My parish is actually pretty good. I want to clarify that. Mine's pretty good.
The larger point is true. I think that we've become, the evil that we're focused on, and there's a reason for it. I mean, we went through, a civil rights movement. There was a rethinking of what the role of women should be in society. And so the evil that we're sort of disposed to recognize is one sort of oppression from the top. And so, we're very susceptible to narratives about individual liberation and expression and the keeping the man from putting his boot on your neck. And all of that sometimes can be appropriate because those things do happen. But what we're not so good at is character formation and trying to form in people the virtue that will allow them, not to be necessarily to be social justice warriors, but to live their individual lives in a way which respects, benefits others, and gives them the greatest chance for personal fulfillment and spiritual growth and everything that is good about living life.
Yeah, I think the point there about there have been real injustices in society that don't just they're not just a question of cultural change. There were decisions that sometimes you have to make political and even legal decisions that deal with some sort of deep set injustices in society. And civil rights is a classic example of something like that. Just waiting for cultural change. That might have gone on for a very long time in some parts of America without some top-down decisions being made. But I think it's important to keep in mind that not every problem in America is a civil rights issue. Not every problem is a justice issue. And there are other problems we should be talking about, but we seem reluctant to do so. I mean, the problem of envy, I think, is a big one in contemporary society. And I think it's partly a function of when you live in a wealthy society, you have a lot of people who become wealthy and they get ahead of everyone else. And the people who are not getting as wealthy as fast, they tend to get envious of that. And those sorts of habits need to be called out and discouraged and pointed out. Just because someone's wealthier than you doesn't mean that they're a bad person. There's no indication that this person has oppressed you or anything like that. So again, these are complex questions. And part of the issue is I think that we often think that politics is the way that we automatically deal with all these issues. And sometimes politics is actually the last place you want to be talking about some of these questions, because politics is often not the way in which you deal with some of these deeper problems of what some people would call problems of the human soul.
Yeah, I mean, to go back to the last point, I mean, many people have observed that with the decline of organized religion, politics has become its replacement. It's become a new form of religion, and it simply doesn't function very well as that.
I love that concept of envy because I really think like in a lot of ways the difference between a conservative like in the true form and someone who's very far to the left, and I look at some of these like younger socialists, there is like an envy. It is like Elon Musk, for example, like he hit $1 trillion and people, or I think it was 1 trillion, whatever it was, but people on the left like lost their mind. I think a lot of people on the right were just like, well, good for him. Like, there was just that difference. Is very indicative of where we are. I think the left called for change because that happened, and I don't think people on the right really, thought too much about it, honestly.
Yeah, although I will say that I've noticed on sections of the right, there's a certain animus against, for example, big corporations. I've noticed that. And I've even seen Republican politicians call for things like quote unquote workers' representatives to be put on the boards of publicly traded corporations. I think Vice President Vance has called for that in the past. And he and Elizabeth Warren are on the same page when it comes to some of those particular questions. So I think you're right that generally speaking, one of the differences between the right and left in America, at least I guess since the 1960s, is that the conservatives have generally celebrated people becoming successful, etc., whereas the political left has been suspicious of that. But I worry that some of that suspicion has crept into parts of the right as well.
It has. It's what's driving. I think it's what's driving tariffs. It's what's going to drive. I think like we talk about Francesca Hong, and we'll see if she becomes the nominee. It likely is to be the case. But one of her biggest openings on the right, I think, is going to be her push to get rid of data centers, or like this idea that we need to put a stop to AI. And one of the other angles I could see is we're going to punish companies that replace workers with AI. Like that is something that I could also see. Not just Republican voters maybe gravitating towards, depending on their economic circumstance, but maybe even Republican politicians at some point. I'd be curious what you guys thought about that.
I could see, I would worry that one of the responses to, say, for example, states starting to states or cities leveling higher taxes, one of the responses, of course, is that businesses just get up and leave. Wealthy people just get up and leave, and they take their assets with them. I think some people on the left, the Democratic Socialist group, are talking about things like, well, we're going to tax them when they leave the state and they take their wealth with them. I don't know. I didn't even know if that's constitutional, but I've heard some of them saying some of these things. There are some groups on the right, I think, who would make a similar type of argument in the sense of, well, you need to be loyal to your community. This community has given you so much, and now you're getting up and leaving, so you need to leave some of your residue behind. I can see some of those arguments, unfortunately, starting to emerge.
Yeah, the left talks about social justice, and the right has decided to call it the common good. And the thing about that is everybody believes in social justice in the abstract, or the common good in the abstract. Our argument is about how you accomplish that. And conservatives have usually had a very healthy skepticism about the notion that the government can sort of usher in some kind of a utopia. It can't do it, and I think that on the sort of the new right, or at least the current iteration of the new right, we're losing sight of that healthy skepticism.
I do want to use that to transition to this other topic, though, which is, how in theory can capitalism push back against this or save itself, or maybe it doesn't need to. Maybe we just need to let the socialists have an election year, and then they'll have their disappointments, and we'll just move on. But just throwing all that out there, like what is the way forward for the capitalist movement, for America's founding principles to push back against some of this?
Well, I've got a few thoughts. One is, I often think that those of us who believe in free markets are very good at making policy arguments, about making empirical arguments. We're very good at that. What we're less good at is making arguments that take those economic positions and transform them into a type of moral and cultural argument. The left are very good at that. The left are very, very good at creating a narrative. In their case, it's about oppression, it's about crises, it's about the need for security and stability, etc. And you see some of that on the right now as well. They're very good at constructing narratives that don't usually measure up to the facts, right? So one narrative would be something like, manufacturing has collapsed in America. Well, that's not true. We're still number one or number two in the world when it comes to manufacturing. It's just that the nature of manufacturing in America has changed. We don't have 1950s manufacturing anymore. We have high-tech manufacturing in America. Now, I could go through and make all that argument and point out all the empirics, but unless I construct a narrative about that, about how the emergence of America as a service economy, the emergence of America as having this dynamic financial sector, the emergence of et cetera, unless I build it into a different type of narrative, I'm going to lose to the person on the left, or the person on the right for that matter, who constructs a very powerful narrative of envy, oppression, and therefore the government needs to intervene to ensure that justice reigns forever. So unless we get better at that, I think we end up always fighting with one arm behind our back.
Yeah, I mean, this bridging the gap proposal we did on communication with populist, leaning Republican voters. That was one of the significant findings that you can't start spouting off about Ronald Reagan and Adam Smith and the invisible hand. You can't use all of these shortcuts that we've used to speak to one another for a long time now. You have to go back to basics, and you have to tell people about how this will affect you. So in the instance of, trades and the high-tech manufacturing that we have in the United States, I think what you want to emphasize is the fact that, you know, people are just not going to make that much money working at a factory that produces t-shirts, because there's not much money in t-shirts. There's a lot of money in chips, and it's we want, yeah, sure, we want manufacturing, but we want, here in the United States, where we have the best workforce in the world, we want the right kind of manufacturing. We want the manufacturing that produces the value that our workers are equipped to produce, and they should be paid and will be paid accordingly.
Kind of fascinating topics in this is the demographic profiles, and I kind of want to go back to this just really quick. I think we're seeing this the kind of the new transplants, but I think that might even be more of a, like, people who just moved to New York. But I don't know if that applies per se to some immigrant populations. We see a lot of people move here from or Puerto Rico to Cuba, and Miami, for example, is just one of the fastest growing, kind of, I would say, Republican coalitions in Florida. And those are all, it's far more transplants and new families. And so I don't know if there's a dynamic here where maybe it's more of just isolated to secular, white Americans who are moving from place to place internally, and not necessarily immigration. But you would go you'd go on X, and you'd see a lot of conservative folks making the argument that immigration is going to change our country. But if you look at some of the polling, the people who harbor these far to the left socialist policies are actually homegrown Americans. I don't know if you guys have, I don't know if you guys have, but it's true. I mean, if you look at the data would support.
A lot of people why do they migrate to America? A lot of them are coming because they obviously are seeking something that's not present in their own countries, which is rule of law, open markets, a certain degree of economic dynamism, high levels of entrepreneurship. That's why a lot of people come to America, because they don't have it in their own countries. I mean, if I was living in Mexico, I'm pretty sure I'd want to get out, or any number of other countries in the world. You can understand why people want to come here. And that's what a lot of migrants come to America for. It's no coincidence that migrants start businesses at a faster clip than native-born Americans. And by the way, we need immigrants, if only to make sure that we don't end up with the sort of demographic problems that Europe is starting to confront now, because immigration is what helps America to avoid at least for the moment, the problems associated with the declining birth rate. So I'm not surprised that you see a good number of immigrants who have, because I often think people think, well, of course they're going to vote for the left, they're going to be voting for the Democratic Party, etc. Well, maybe, but if anything, I think we've seen over the past few years a definite shift away from, in some demographic groups, particularly people from Latin American countries, away from that type of assumption. And even the Democratic Party has talked about that. They can't assume that they have a lock on Latino voters anymore, because their expectations and the nature of the Democratic Party, what it cares about, is not where your average Latino migrant is, whether it's on economic questions or cultural questions either. So it's interesting to see how those types of dynamics are going to play out over time. And I find it fascinating that, as you say, so many of these democratic socialists who they look like pretty much like lily white people like me. I find this absolutely fascinating. And some of the strongest defenders of markets in America today are migrants.
And again, it flies in the face of what you see on X, right? They will sit and say, well, California, or the demographic makeup is changing, and that's what's driving this move to socialism. I don't necessarily think that's true. I think, the most, like, I think in this Democrat primary coming up in Wisconsin, like, I think we're going to see Francesca Hong maybe do the worst, is going to be in traditional, like, African American Democrat constituencies, and where she's going to do the best is in kind of emerging white professional communities. That's what I just think we'll see. And, obviously the primary hasn't happened yet, but that's what I think we'll see.
Yeah, keep in mind that Bernie Sanders is the senator from Vermont.
Exactly. He does not represent Miami or Vegas. I do want to make sure we leave time for our final segment. Sam, you saw this when we sent it over. We kind of close out with, those who do not know history are doomed to repeat it. And so we would like for you to kind of offer a prediction into a moment in American history that you think we are doomed to repeat.
That we are doomed to repeat. Well, I will say this. We often say that we're living in a time of political populism, and that's true, we are. But I would point out that this is hardly the first time we've gone through a period of populism whereby elites, quote unquote, elites are despised. We've seen major changes in the makeup of political parties. Things can move very, very quickly. And this can come from both sides of the political spectrum. I would argue, for example, that the Reagan revolution of the 1980s reflected something like that. It was a pushback against things that had become establishment, like the New Deal, like the Great Society, all these types of things. So I guess my point is that populist movements are not a new phenomenon in America. In fact, I often say every presidential election is a bit of an exercise in populism, right? Because you're appealing to this 330 million citizens, etc. So when we talk about the current political environment in which we're living in, all I'd say is that we've been through some of these movements before in American history, and it can be very discouraging at first when you are dealing with interventionists on the left and interventionists on the right. But the problem that those policies have is that they don't work. And Americans tend to be pretty impatient when they think something is not working. They want to fix it. Americans are quite pragmatic in that way. They're a little less ideologically hidebound than your average Western European, who will go and die in the ditch for an ideological position, no matter how evidently failed it has become. Americans will switch up pretty quickly if they think something is not working.
Populism is a recurring theme. Generally speaking, it comes from some source of frustration and anger. It says, you put it, it's pushback. And what typically happens is that the traditional political parties identify that, they respond to it, they absorb it, and we move on. And I think that that's the type of thing that's going to happen again. It's one of the reasons we did this Bridging the Gap report. Others have done similar things to try to figure out, well, what is this source of frustration? What is driving people to take positions that we think are horribly misguided? They're not doing it because they're bad people. They're not doing it because they're stupid. They're not doing it because they're racist. They're doing it because they perceive a real problem for which they have poor solutions. And I think that we need to understand what that is and need to address it within our traditional constitutional framework. And the talk about repeating history calls for departing from our traditional constitutional framework are not new either. I just finally got around to reading Christopher Cox's biography of Woodrow Wilson, and I didn't like Woodrow Wilson when I picked the book up. I really don't like Woodrow Wilson now. I mean, he's even worse than I thought. Um, but one of the things that he wanted to do is get away from the checks and balances. He wanted a government that was organic, not one that whose various organs were set against one another. Well, there's a reason why we have that, and I certainly hope that we continue to have that. But uh, to some extent, the current DSA movement is really at war with the very concept of limited government and separation of powers. I hope we don't fall for it.
Gentlemen, thank you for an incredible discussion. I thought we really did more than scratch the surface on the rise of socialism and the impact it's having in politics. I thought, Sam, you gave us a lot of different stuff to think about. I thought with religion and culture were not necessarily things I thought we'd cover today, but that really fit into the discussion. So that was really great. And Rick, as always, really appreciate you being a part of this.
Well, thanks for having me.
We appreciate everybody who tuned in. As always, you can find us wherever you get your podcast, but also if you have any trouble, you can go to will-law.org/podcast, and that's to get you everything you need to know. So we appreciate it, guys, and we'll see you next time.